All right. Good morning. I guess it's still technically morning for us here in the Pacific Northwest. Good day wherever you are joining us from. We apologize for our bit of a delay here. We had some technical difficulties, which thankfully we got resolved. And trust me, we have the great Jim Wilke with us today, and it's well worth the wait. So for those of you that are not familiar with Jim and his work, there's information about him at the beginning of this post. You can also read about him on Wikipedia. But he's one of the top jazz producers, and he's been named one of the top jazz producers by Jazz Times and the Jazz Journalists Association. He's also part of the Seattle Jazz Hall of Fame. He's produced over hundreds of jazz recordings and shows online and for radio. And he's been involved with Seattle radio since 1969 or 1961. This is the great Jim Wilke. Jim, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
So I appreciate your patience with getting all the tech stuff figured out, but we're so thrilled to have you. And for our viewers, I'm going to interview Jim for about 45 minutes here. And if you have any questions, feel free to put the questions in the comments, and we'll do our best to get to them as we can if we have time here. So, Jim, what I'd like to start with is how you've had such a massive career involved with music and tons of great musicians, several of which I'm going to ask you, but just off the top, I made a list here: Duke Ellington, John Coltrane, Jim Hall, Cannonball, Adderley, Stan Getz, Dizzy Gillespie, Horace, Art Blakey, and the list goes on and on and on. How did you get involved with music? How did you get started?
I missed the last part of your question. It's cutting out just a little bit. Problem.
How did you get started involved with music in the beginning?
Well, I played a bit. I was I guess you'd call me a failed alto saxophonist. I discovered late night radio, and that's where I discovered jazz. And there was no single person in my life who pointed me in that direction or anything like that. I just listened to late night radio, and I discovered jazz, and I liked it a lot. I liked the personalities. I liked the stories about the musicians and so on. And that was how I fell into it, really, at the beginning.
Okay. And this was, what time period was this? Where are we in terms of years?
This was in the 50s.
Okay.
In the 50s.
Okay. And so was there a particular radio station that you were listening to, or an on-air host that you enjoyed a program that they were presenting?
Yeah. At that time, there were still a lot of AM stations that were so-called designated clear channels. And that meant there was no one else on that frequency on the North American continent at night. And so they had this massive sky waves that would bounce off the ionosphere and land several states over. And I was listening to a New Orleans radio station, listening in Iowa. And the show was Moonglow with Martin. Dick Martin came on from midnight to 2 a.m. And there was another guy out of Little Rock, Arkansas, surprisingly enough, by the name of Johnny Holiday. And that was on KTCS, I believe it was. And it was... both of those, I think Holiday was on from 10 to midnight, and the other one was on from midnight to 2 a.m. So there's a big chunk of, the central part of the country could hear these two guys back to back, 4 hours of jazz every night.
Wow. Okay. And so were you listening to this prior to playing the saxophone, or which came first, the radio and then the saxophone, or the saxophone and then the radio, or was it kind of at the same time?
It's kind of at the same time. The saxophone, I think, first in high school band, and it was concert band and marching band. I didn't march. Red Fox one time. Red Fox said, "I'll take a cab, but I won't march." But at any rate, it was playing marches and concert band pieces. And then I heard jazz, and then I started trying to play jazz on the saxophone. And I met some like-minded guys who were a little older than I, who took me along, and You asked me if there's anything I didn't want to talk about. I'll mention it, but I won't go into great detail. We had a band, 5 guys in the band, and we needed a name for the band. We didn't want to call it by someone's name, so we decided we'd call it 4 Jumps and a Jerk.
Okay.
And people
Okay.
would ask the inevitable question, "Who's the jerk?" And each of us would say, "Him."
Yeah. Good.
Him.
Good. You guys were friends, right? Oh, okay. Well, so as a saxophonist, as an alto saxophonist, and someone who's listening to jazz, who were some musicians of the day that were inspirations for you, that you kind of gravitated towards their style?
Lee Konitz and Paul Desmond. Charlie Parker was beyond my grasp.
Yeah.
But
fair enough.
I liked Lee Konitz a lot, and I listened to him quite a little bit, and I liked the fluid style of both of those saxophonists, lyrical.
Yes. Well, that I guess I would ask then, in all your years producing shows for radio and working with all these wonderful artists, did you ever have the opportunity to work with either Paul Desmond or Lee Konitz and spend some time with them?
Never did. Just didn't have the opportunity. But I never did anything with Brubeck. I never had the opportunity to do anything with Brubeck. And Lee Konitz, I didn't meet until many, many years later, but a few years ago, he played the Ballard Jazz Festival. And
Right.
I finally got a chance to meet Lee Konitz. Oddly enough, it was on my birthday. And I told John Bishop, I said, that's one of the best birthday presents ever, is to sit and have a drink after the gig at Egan's with Lee Konitz.
Amazing. I was talking to one of everyone's friend around here, musician Matt Jorgensen, about that concert and producing it in the festival. He has some interesting stories about that, which I'm sure you know, which we're not going to talk about here. But yes, I heard it was a great concert. Well, I wanted to ask you, so you're playing music. You're playing music with friends and you're listening to jazz. How did you get involved with radio and music production and all that kind of good stuff?
We had at the University of Iowa in Iowa City, where I took a degree in speech, we had a very active radio station. It was one of the first radio stations west of the Mississippi. As a matter of fact, it went on the air the same year as KKWO in Pittsburgh, 1929, I think it was. And this was an old style radio station with big windows, big studio windows. We had 3 grand pianos in 3 different studios, including a 9-foot grand in the biggest studio. The others had baby grands. We had separate operation with an engineer on the other side of the double glass, and you threw him cues when to play the music, when to play the theme, and
any of this kind of stuff,
you cued your mic, when to. Yes, and that too. Yeah, I'm done. And so that was my initial training in radio, was working in a dual operation like that. And it was, we had a lot of formal programs and concerts. We did a lot of live concerts. We had radio lines, radio lines around campus to other buildings where we could do remote broadcasts from those buildings. And we broadcast concerts and lectures, and we even had a theater production unit, and we did live radio drama too. So it was quite an education.
Sure. Well, so then, because I know you have been involved with radio in Seattle since 1961. How did you end up from Iowa in Seattle? How did that take place? From Iowa to Seattle.
Well, I visited out here. Yeah, I visited out here between high school and college, and decided this was a place I'd like to live. And the way it worked out, I had some asthma and hay fever problems in Iowa, and I I could breathe so much better out here than any place I'd ever been before. That kind of was a big attraction. I had a sister who lived out here, and so that gave me a little introduction to the area as well. And my sister was a pharmacist, and she's about 10 years older than I. Anyhow, came out here after college without a job because I just wanted to work here. I didn't find something right away, but I spent 2 years in California at a station down in Sacramento, and then came back up and found work at King.
Okay. Okay. And so when you were working at King, what kind of programming were you involved with? Has it always been jazz, or were you working on other facets of the music industry? Other styles, I should say.
King at that time had an interesting format that Dan Shannon was the operations director there, and he had devised this format he called Showcase of the Lively Arts. And so basically it was a real concentration on all the performing arts and all kinds of music, as well as drama and poetry and interviews with artists, just lots of different things. Jazz was part of it. That was during the folk music revival, was part of that too. And so Dan was very interested in folk music. I was very interested in jazz. And so we added those into the mix with classical music. So we had quite a variety of different programming.
Yes. Well, I'm curious then. So you were involved with artists at that time, I'm assuming, that were coming through town and playing in clubs, well-known, world-renowned artists, but you were also on the scene and interacting with a lot of the well-known artists here in the Seattle area and the Pacific Northwest. Is that true?
Yeah, through the Penthouse Jazz Club.
Okay. And I just listened to something the other day. I was on, I was looking up something. It was a Cannonball Adderley album that had just recently been released, which is live at the Penthouse, which I believe you had a large hand in, because I can hear you emceeing on that album.
It was kind of a one-man show. I was doing the live mix to broadcast, as well as my mixer was attached to the house sound system. So from my position at the mixer, I could introduce the show, and it would go on the air as well as in the house. And the tapes were made at the studio during the live broadcast. So as it went on the air, it was also being recorded. But it was a live show, live, no fix it in the mix.
Right. Well, and I know, I guess I would ask, I know you've produced some of those that are now starting to come out on albums. How many more tapes do you have that are, that maybe have not seen the light of day? And do you have plans to release more of those things as albums in the near future?
Yeah, I'm working with several record producers who have the connections to be able to carry it through, but they take care of the clearances, and with the families and the mechanical reproduction rights and all of that stuff. So they take care of all those details. I've been doing some of the transfers from analog tape to digital transfer. But there's quite a bit of material there. And there's 2 or 3 different record producers have looked at this material and said, I'd like to do that one. I'd like to do this one. I would like to have just been able to work with one, but it wasn't quite that simple. And
Sure.
So there's some picking and choosing going on. Some of these albums have come, they've been taken from several different broadcasts and mixed together and resequenced and so on. But most of them, I think, are pretty much complete broadcasts. We were limited to 30 minutes. That was a AFM rule, American Federation of Musicians, that we could do a live broadcast, and the musicians would perform gratis as long as it was a place that was regularly employing live music, and it was a promotion for some place that was regularly doing live music. So the AFM gave us permission, the American Federation of Musicians. Musicians Union allowed us to do those live broadcasts in that circumstance once a week.
What I'm curious, what other artists that you're very excited about? I'm assuming you'd be excited about releasing their broadcasts on albums. Is there anything that you're really looking forward to being able to finally see the light of day in terms of cool albums or artists?
Well, I was really excited about the Cannonball Adderley coming out because I thought those were exceptional. And also, I think that the Herald Land, which has just been issued, is going to be a surprise to a lot of people who maybe have sort of forgotten about Herald Land if they knew about him in the first place. But he was the original tenor player in the Clifford Brown Quintet, and
Right.
he was replaced by Sonny Rollins.
Right. Well, I think most students of jazz that get into study, I mean, if you've heard, Clifford Brown's Joy Spring or Blues Walk, then you're familiar with Harold Land. There's he's done a lot of other stuff, but those ones are kind of like everyone's heard those, Wonderful. Okay, well, I'd kind of like to ask, I know that there's so many large name artists, and this is no way detracting from any of the local artists because they're equally large name artists too, but who were some Seattle musicians back in the 60s that you got to interact with and spend time with and be around?
Well, first of all, I just want to say about some of the name artists that I worked with. For me, I think one of the greatest moments was doing Duke Ellington Orchestra and doing a live broadcast with Ellington, because I admired Ellington from the first time I got interested in jazz. I thought this is really something. And I saw the Ellington band on numerous occasions as a kid growing up, as a teen, actually. I learned to follow the band, and they would come through my corner of Iowa, and they play a string of one-nighters, and maybe 3 or 4 nights in a row, I could go hear them in different places in my driving range. I could get the family car and go see the Ellington band. But that was a real thrill. And then to do a live broadcast with them, and, under my fingertips, mixing Harry Carney and Johnny Hodges and Cat Anderson and all these cats. It was pretty amazing. As far as regionally, one of the guys that I worked with quite a little bit in the 60s was Chuck Metcalf. And Chuck was a bass player, and he was a guy who made things happen. He was an idea man, and as a composer, as a band leader, and also as a guy who would see an empty storefront and say, let's start a jazz club.
Yeah.
And he was behind the opening of the Jazz Gallery, which was a place at the south end of the University Bridge in Seattle. The Langolin had been there for a while, and Langolin was no more, but Chuck figured out a way to change it into a space that would really work well as a jazz room. And we had to get some sort of license for it because we were presenting entertainment, and we found that a coffee house suited our purposes well. We didn't have to have a liquor license, though that probably would have made it financially more suitable. But we struggled along with that for a while, but that was typical of what Chuck would get organized and doing.
Yeah.
He was one of the moving forces behind the old Seattle Jazz Society in the 60s, when there wasn't much happening for local musicians. The Penthouse was going, bringing national musicians through, but there weren't any places regularly presenting local musicians. So the Jazz Society was put together to present local musicians. We'd work a deal with a restaurant or a bar or something like that, where we'd pay the band, collect admission charge, and the house would get the bar receipts and food and so on and so forth. So we presented a lot of programs that way.
Okay. I wanted to ask you, and again, my questions are kind of all over the map here, so I apologize, but I wanted to ask you, starting in producing and being around jazz radio and around all these wonderful artists from 1961 forward and prior, listening as an enthusiast, all the way up to 2021. looking at jazz and how many different styles of music that it's incorporated and ways that it's gone in the past 60 years, what are some of your thoughts and opinions about jazz as a music in general? This is a broad question, I apologize, but where it's gone, where it's going, where it's been, what are your thoughts about that as someone who's been so closely tied to the music for many years?
I think one of the most appealing things about the music is the potential for individual expression. And jazz is so much what each individual brings to it. One of the great democratic movements in music, because it allows everybody to have personal input into it. It has a general form in which people can work, but what's important is what you bring to it yourself. One of the greatest dismissals you can say about a musician is to call him a clone of somebody else, or he's just copying someone else's style. You know, where's your own stuff? And a great premium is placed on the ability of individual musician to come up with a personal statement in the music and to be instantly identifiable. You know, the great tenor players, I could hear 2 or 3 notes of them and tell you immediately who it is who's playing it, just from the way they approach 2 or 3 notes and the timbre of their horn, their approach. Maybe Jay Thomas could tell you what kind of mouthpiece they had.
Yeah, for listeners that don't know Jay,
so
they don't know what you're talking about, but any musician in the Northwest or around the world that plays knows exactly that joke. Jay could totally tell you, I'm sure. All right. Well, wonderful.
I want to mention let me tell you something about Jay. You know, his new book is coming out, and it's a collection of personal stories. And I've read it, and I was one of the proofreaders for the book. We're trying to make sure he got everybody's name spelled right, because he's brushed up against a lot of people over his years. But it's going to be quite a book. I think a great collection of jazz stories. So watch for it.
Okay, yeah, I have to do another interview with Jay and ask him about it. We'll have to get him on here again. Well, again, I want, and I haven't really ashamedly done a lot of thinking about how I want to interview this. I'm just kind of just shooting from the hip here. But out of all of the musicians that you've been around locally, nationally, all that kind of stuff, who are some of your favorites? And I know you mentioned Duke Ellington and Chuck Metcalfe, but who are some other ones that have been kind of your favorites to be around and interact with, and why?
Oh, that's it's one of those questions I'm afraid to mention anybody for fear of those I leave out and wish I would have included. But it's been a great opportunity, you know, from the early years, people like Gerald Brashear and Milt Jarrett, who I knew back in the 60s. And then, you know, Freddie Greenwell, Don Lanfear, of course, as a person as well as a musician. Don was very inspirational to me. Just as a good guy, well respected and honest, and treated everybody with great fairness and equanimity. You know, he's just a great. As a matter of fact, there's a few souvenirs of Don in my studio, including an autographed picture of Charlie Parker hanging on the wall in here, because Don was a great follower of Bird, and it's autographed to Don. It's Bird's publicity photo autographed to Don.
Yeah. I remember I was very fortunate to be around Don and take lessons with him. Probably this would be like the late 90s before he passed away. And I remember I would go to his home. It was him and Midge, and it was Kirkland area. And yes. he had all of the posters and promo things signed, and you go in there and you're like, oh my gosh, you know, I mean, not only is Don jazz history, but all of the things and all the interactions of people that he had, you know, personal stories and connections with was very impressive.
Yeah. I was happy to share a good bit of that history with him at different times, and not in formal interviews, just, you know, hanging out. Stories.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'd like to know a little bit more about kind of your connection with Seattle, because not only, I mean, I've had the good pleasure of doing a couple concerts where you were recording them. I think one was the Seattle Art Museum for one of the Earshot series things, and there was another thing too, and I can't recall which one it was, or maybe they both were the Art Museum. But I also was very fortunate to have you as an instructor at Cornish College of the Arts. So I'd like to ask you about your relationship with Cornish, and how did that come about, and the way that it was presented, at least when you were the professor there, it was a music history, and one semester was with Peter Mack, which was kind of geared towards classical music, and then the other half of the year was jazz history, and you led and taught that, and a lot of us were very fortunate to have your experiences shared with us. But can you talk a little bit about your association with Cornish?
Well, it came about at a time when I think around the time that King and I parted company, and I had Bellevue Community College and Cornish College both called me independently, saying, you know, you always said you were too busy to do this, but now that you have some time, would you consider teaching? And I said yes on both counts. So I was teaching at Bellevue Community College before they had a campus. We used Newport High School in the evening. That was the beginning of Bellevue College. That's where I first taught. It was a funny thing about teaching. That first time I walked into a class, I was so nervous. You know, I had years of experience being on the radio, and I was very relaxed on the radio. But walking in and seeing my audience for the first time was a different experience. My knees were shaking and the sweat was trickling down the middle of my back.
Yeah.
So it was a new and different experience for me teaching a class like that. But it's become second nature to me now. So that'd be a good line for a song. It's second nature to me now.
Yeah.
Like breathing out and breathing in.
Yeah, well, I think I can only speak for myself, but I'm sure many of my classmates felt the same way. You know, we were so used to hearing your voice on the radio, and then all of a sudden there you are standing in front of us, and we didn't want to, you know, screw up in front of Jim Wilke and be a horrible student or not know what we're talking about. So it was a mutual, it was a two-way street. It was a two-way street, you know. So, well, I'm curious, and again, certainly not fishing for any compliments. But so you were at Cornish for quite some time. Were there any students that stuck out in your mind that you knew of their playing and worked with them as students, and then also later on in their careers? Any recollections about that you'd like to share?
It's an odd thing because I never got too well acquainted with my students individually, partly on purpose and partly just because I didn't have an office at any of these places I taught. I just would pop in, teach class, and leave. I didn't hang out on campus or anything like that. So it was just part of my weekly schedule and daily schedule. So I did not get acquainted, but I was surprised to see sometimes names pop up and say, oh my goodness, that's right, they were in my class. I forgot about that, you know. And yeah, and here they are now, you know, they're got a new album.
Yeah.
Look at this.
Yeah, I can't believe they graduated because they can't spell. Their papers were terrible. So, all right. Well, I'd like to ask you, how did you, actually, before I ask this next question, I want to ask you about your opinions about, you know, after working with a jazz, quote unquote, jazz school and being affiliated with an institution that does jazz education, what are your thoughts about here currently in 2021 about jazz music as a whole and how it's taught and represented in an academic setting? I know that that's kind of a double-edged sword. There's many good things about studying jazz in school, and maybe a lot of the older musicians or current musicians would say there's a lot of bad things about studying jazz in school. So what are your opinions as someone who's you know, been involved with music production and radio and being around all these artists? What are your feelings about jazz education as it stands right now? And I understand this is a big question, so feel free to deal with what you'd like.
Yeah, it's very difficult to say, because there's good things about it and bad things about it. We have a tendency to turn out a lot of clones. Sometimes musicians who are chosen to emulate the personal favorites of the teacher, and I don't think they're necessarily significant people. I say if you're going to try to clone someone, why use this for a model? And that's, a lot of personal opinion comes into this. A lot of it's pretty subjective. I think teaching jazz in a formal situation has a tendency to turn out more musicians and have greater similarities because they all come from the same thing. Whereas the old style was learning on the stand, and you learn some pretty hard lessons, like in the film Bird, in the famous story about how early jam session, he's laughed off the stage. Makes you go home and practice more or give it up.
Yeah.
You realize that that there's a great premium on originality. And I think that's what makes this music great, is its originality and personal statement, but still playing nicely with others.
Okay. I agree. That being said,
but to teach it, to teach it, you have to codify it.
Yeah. Yes.
To teach it, you have to codify it to a certain extent. You have to have some sort of lesson plan. You have to take it from A to B to C, so on and so forth.
Okay.
And that has a tendency to,
Well, that being said, in terms of artists that would be considered contemporary, like modern day jazz artists or / innovators, who are some artists that you kind of look to that are, and again, I'm sure there are many, but who are some artists that you kind of look to and really enjoy the way that they play and what they're doing with the music, both looking to the past and moving things forward? Is there anyone in particular that sticks out in your mind, or certain artists that you really enjoy currently that are, doing things right now today?
Well, I'll just mention two. One is Pat Metheny, and some people might be a little surprised that I would choose to name a musician who's so popular. Well, I don't hold that against him. I think he's an extremely original musician. He's a very lyrical musician. He has new concepts. He has integrated electronics and acoustic music extremely successfully and very, very well. And I look forward to anything with Pat Metheny on it, and it's always fresh and new. A pianist that I particularly enjoy right now, and I will listen to him every opportunity I get, is Sullivan Fortner. And I think Sullivan is just an amazing performer. I've seen him. He played with Roy Hargrove, and he played at Jazz Alley several times with Roy Hargrove and with Roberta Gambarini. And I most recently saw him in a solo performance at the Village Vanguard. And these Village Vanguard things are pretty cool. Streaming, you can watch them online, and a $10 cover charge. When are you going to get into the Vanguard for $10? Right?
Right. And
to see him playing solo, it was really interesting, this particular streaming event with Sullivan Fortner. No audience, just the cameraman and sound people, and not much of them either, I don't think. Fairly static shots. It was really like sitting at a table in the Vanguard and listening to somebody play. The interesting thing I thought was different about that particular show was the fact it was done in black and white. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting. Those pictures on stage right, on the left side of the stage, as you look at it, black and white photos. I think a lot of them by Francis Wolff were originally Blue Note album covers.
Right,
black and white. And they were doing this show in black and white. I thought it was so cool. And Sullivan it was almost like he didn't have a program in mind when he sat down to play. He didn't have a list of tunes that he would take a look at and see, what he's going to play next. He just sort of thought, and he didn't think about the next tune until he finished the one he was playing. It
Yeah.
was wonderfully off the cuff and beautiful playing. He's can draw upon various styles and so on. I'd really recommend people keep an eye on this guy and an ear out for him any chance you get. Sullivan Fortner. Yeah.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
And
Well, here's another question for you, and this is, I guess, more kind of related to, and you've touched on this a little bit already, but more related to the music business and the business of jazz. In my lifetime, I'm 42 years old, and I've seen several clubs come and go in terms of places for musicians to play and attempt to make a living as a performer. I know you're not 42, and that's not a dig; it's just a fact. And you've seen many more. So not only in the time that you've been around jazz and clubs and all that kind of stuff, and also on air and in the business of the radio, and even with COVID-19 and the rest of this, what are your thoughts and opinions about venues and their viability and sustainability? Because you've seen so many come and go. What are your thoughts about running a jazz club, and is there any hope for jazz clubs to maintain and keep things going into the future? And if they were, what would be some, if there is, what would be some things that you would see as some pitfalls to people that wanted to do the business of presenting music, live jazz in particular?
that's a book.
Again, that's a big topic. Yeah, I'm sorry.
I can say what I think works well and what has worked well in the past from the standpoint of presenting the music. I can't speak to the economics of it, but I look at some jazz clubs and I say, as a business model, it's doomed to failure. It is never going to maybe not be even physically big enough to be financially sustainable. You need to have 100 people or more night after night, I think, in order to be able to keep something going over a long period of time. I'll tell you what I have enjoyed as a listener and as a club goer are places like the New Orleans Creole Restaurant on Pioneer Square back 20 years ago, and more recently Tula's. Both of those clubs are now gone, but they were a big part of the social experience of enjoying jazz. From the standpoint of the audience, that when the music ended, a lot of times people would stand up and talk to the people at the table next to them. And they would introduce themselves, get acquainted. They would ask questions about each other. They would talk about the music. And that was one of the things that was very appealing to me about the music from the start, is this social interchange that goes on between members of the audience, between members of the band on stage. And I think that encourages it among the audience. They're not standoff people. Most jazz clubs, the route to and from the stage is where? Through the audience. And
Right.
You get done with the set, you come off, you walk right down into the audience. And inevitably, someone will stop you and have a question about a piece of music you played, or what's that funny horn you're playing, or what kind of mouthpiece, what kind of reeds do you like?
Yeah. Do you ever take a shower? Any of that kind of stuff, Well, and I would agree. I think for me, growing up in Tacoma, it was Red Kelly's, and I think one of the things about Tula's and also about Red Kelly's,
Absolutely.
they were, the proprietors
And
were musicians.
And Presidio before Red Kelly's. Remember Presidio? Were you around then?
No, I was born in 1978, so some of that was before my time, but I've heard lots of stories about it through a lot of the older musicians. So for me, I mean, Red Kelly's was the one on, particularly end of middle school or high school. But I would say, on some of those clubs, I would attribute, and maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think I am, is I would attribute the success of those clubs to the musicians that were kind of the people running the ship. You had Red Kelly, who had toured with all these wonderful musicians, and he had all these relationships with musicians and also the audience. And then at Tula's, you had Mac, who had been in the Navy for several years and was a musician and knew all these other musicians. And you had these strong personalities that kind of knew knew not just the business, but the music business as well, and had those relationships. And I think there's something to be said for that. And again, I might be totally wrong because I haven't opened my own jazz club, but I have noticed that the ones that seem to have the longest running, or at least long running histories, tend to have that as part of the lineup. Would you say that's a fair assumption?
Yes, I think so, and that speaks to the social aspect, the social interchange that I was talking about.
Yeah, yeah. All right, we're getting close to that time, and I know we started
Red
late.
Kelly.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead, please.
I was just going to say I wanted to additionally mention Red Kelly because he was one of the great characters of Northwest jazz, and a lot of this music is built around characters and people who are entertainers beyond just playing a horn or playing a bass or whatever. They're storytellers. Guys like Floyd Standifer and Jay Thomas. It's a lot of folks who just that social aspect of it that I was speaking of.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. Well, as I was going to say, is I know we got a bit of a late start here, and I apologize. But I want to open things up to some of our listeners if they have questions. And we do have a question here, and it says, so Jim was talking about when he first started getting into jazz music, how he found the stories behind jazz musicians to be interesting. What in particular did you find interesting about their stories?
Well, I found it interesting that that the musicians moved around sometimes from one group to another, and you'd think they were totally identified with one group. Have you ever heard of a song "When Cootie Left Duke"?
Yes.
Yeah, it's based on a famous story. Cootie Williams, the trumpet player, was Duke Ellington's principal go-to guys in the trumpet section, and he got a bid from Benny Goodman to go with the Benny Goodman band. And it was actually a song. I mean, stuff grows out of these legends and these stories and so on. And there's some excellent books. Bill Crow wrote a couple of great books. Bill Crow was a bass player from Kirkland, as a matter of fact, but he played a long time with Marion McPartland, and he played with numerous other people. But he was in New York, and he played Birdland and Broadway, and that's the name of one of his books, From Birdland to Broadway. And Bill just was a great collector of stories, and he was a member of Local 802, the New York Musicians Union, and he wrote a regular column for Local 802 newsletter, and that column became the basis for one of the books. Because he was published in these things, people start sending him stories, and he became a great collector. I'd really recommend those books by Bill Crow. There's also one by Gene Lees called "Meet Me at Jim and Andy's," and Jim and Andy's was a bar in New York City that it was a musicians' hangout, and I think there was a recording studio upstairs. And the story goes that once in a while they would have someone not able to make a recording session, a second tenor part or something like that, and they would call down to Jim and Andy's and say, "Hey, who's there? Any tenor players? We need a tenor player up here." Because the guys actually got gigs just hanging out at Jim and Andy's. But that's another great book. Meet Me at Jim and Andy's.
That sounds amazing. Well, I don't see any other questions just yet. If anybody has any questions, let us know. But before we wrap up here, there are a couple questions that I would like to ask you, just selfish questions. Stan Getz, what was it like working with Stan Getz?
There were two people I was so in awe of, I could barely bring myself to start a conversation with them. I didn't interview either one of them. I did live broadcasts with both of them. One was Stan Getz, the other was Bill Evans. And I had you know, such respect for both of these musicians. I didn't know how to begin a conversation. I just kind of was in awe of them and frozen at the prospect of talking to them. And to hear the sounds going through my headphones and knowing that I was putting it out on the air was a great thrill for me, like doing the Duke Ellington Orchestra or somebody like that, someone I'd listened to for many, many years, and to be part of a presentation that involved them was a very special moment for me.
Yeah.
Neither one of them was particularly outgoing, but I felt like they told their stories through their music, and that was enough for me.
Yeah. What about, I sense just from reading his book recently, Let's Get to the Nitty Gritty, Horace Silver seems like he'd be much more of a warm personality just based on the way that he's written his book. Is that a fair assumption?
It is very much so, I'd say. He was a very friendly, outgoing guy. And Art Blakey and Horace Silver played the Penthouse a few weeks apart. And it was interesting hearing these two groups so close together. And unfortunately, at the moment, Art Blakey's band was a little ragged and Horace Silver's was very tight. And Art Blakey seemed to draw a whole lot better. So Art Blakey had a full house and Horace Silver had half a house. I thought that was really a shame because people really missed a great band with Horace Silver. You know, I've always, since, you know, essentially they sort of broke in together. The original band was Horace Silver's Jazz Messengers, I believe. And Art Blakey took it over and Horace Silver started his own quintet with the way that lineage ran. But they were both really interesting and powerful people in their own ways, and they're quite different from each other, but had enormous admiration for both of them.
Yeah, yeah, wonderful, wonderful. Well, we're getting close to that time. I want to ask you, if you were now in 2021, you've had all these experiences with all these wonderful artists. If you were speaking to prospective musicians that are thinking about, you know, going further down the path of becoming musicians, what's some advice that you would give them to maybe consider, or things, your opinions that would help them become better musicians or be more successful in what they're doing?
I'm immediately reminded of the Phil Woods audition for music school story. You know that one?
No.
Phil Woods said that, you know, for someone who's considering a career as a professional jazz musician, the audition should be you get on a bus with blacked out windows and ride around for several hours. You get out and you set up and play a couple of tunes, and then you tear down and get back on the bus and drive around. And you do this for 2 or 3 days. And if you survive that and still want to be a musician, then you'll be admitted to music school.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Yeah. Wonderful. Well, I want to thank you so much for your time. I hope you know, I'm assuming you do, but I hope you know how much you mean to not only us here in the Northwest, but to music fans throughout the world that have enjoyed your programming and the work. Because, I mean, sometimes as musicians or people involved with the music industry, it is sometimes thankless work, but hopefully you realize what you mean to all of us and how much we love you and appreciate what you've done for all of us. And so thank you for joining us, and thank you to all of our listeners for joining us. We're going to be doing a live stream performance later on today, starting at 6 o'clock with a bunch of brand new music. Also a piece written for Jim, hastily written, so don't get your hopes up, but it is a piece written for you nonetheless. But for our listeners and viewers, if you enjoy these programs that we do every single week, feel free to make a donation. You can do that via Venmo or PayPal or mailing a check, and that information's on the link here. But Jim, thank you again so much for your time. We appreciate it, and I hope to do another one of these in the future if we can, and because I've got many more questions still. We're just out of time for today, but thank you so much.
Thank you, Kareem. Good talking to you.
Likewise. Take care.